July 1945. A requisitioned cinema hall in a U.S. POW camp. The order was unusual. No work detail today. Instead, Elsa and 200 other German women prisoners were marched into a dusty, bomb-damaged theater. They whispered nervously as they took their seats. Was this entertainment? A lecture? Elsa smoothed her gray uniform skirt, looking around. The screen was blank, a white eye staring back at them. The air smelled of stale tobacco and anxiety. Then came the sound that silenced the room. Click, clack. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall were slammed shut. Then, the distinct metallic sound of a heavy bolt sliding home. They were locked in. Panic flared instantly. A woman near the front stood up, but a guard raised his hand. "Sit down," he barked. This wasn't a show. This was confinement. Lieutenant Vance walked onto the small stage. He didn't carry a weapon, only a microphone. He looked at the sea of women, secretaries, nurses, telephone operators. Women who claimed they were just doing their jobs. Vance's face was hard, his eyes tired. He had seen Buchenwald 2 weeks ago. He knew what these women refused to know. "You say you did not see," Vance spoke, his voice amplified and distorted by the speakers. "You say you did not know. Today you will see. Today you will know. No one leaves until the reel ends," Vance warned. And no one looks away. He signaled to the projection booth. The lights in the hall died abruptly, plunging them into total darkness. The only sound was the mechanical purr of the projector starting up. Whir click whir. A beam of sharp blue-white light cut through the smoke-filled air, hitting the screen. Elsa gripped the armrests of her seat. She expected propaganda newsreels about lost battles. She was not prepared for the truth. The title card flashed on the screen. Die Todesmühlen, the death mills. The grainy black and white footage began. It wasn't soldiers marching. It was a bulldozer. It was pushing piles that looked like rag dolls. Elsa squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes. Then the camera zoomed in. They weren't dolls. They were people. Skeletons with skin. The first gasp echoed through the theater, followed by a heavy, suffocating silence. Whispers erupted in the darkness like a hiss. "Propaganda," a sharp voice muttered from the row behind Elsa. "It is wax figures. It is Hollywood tricks. They are trying to break us." Elsa wanted to believe it. Her mind desperately grabbed onto that excuse. Yes, she thought. Germans are civilized. We write poetry. We compose symphonies. We do not build factories of death. She stared at the screen, looking for the strings, for the paint, for the proof that it was a lie. She squinted against the flickering light, her heart pounding a rhythm of denial. But the camera on the screen moved relentlessly. It panned over a pile of shoes, thousands of them. Children's sandals, workers' boots, women's heels. Then it showed the suitcases. Elsa gasped. She saw a name painted on a leather suitcase in neat white Gothic script. Hans Müller, Hamburg. It was a German name, written in a German hand. The Hollywood trick theory began to crack. Wax figures don't wear worn-out shoes. Wax figures don't pack suitcases with family photos. "Don't look," a woman screamed. A prisoner in the front row, unable to bear the sight of the bulldozers pushing bodies into a pit, covered her face with her hands. She started to rock back and forth, sobbing loudly. "Lies, all lies," she wailed. Immediately, a flashlight beam cut through the dark theater, landing on her. An American MP marched down the aisle, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't shout. He simply walked up to the woman and tapped her shoulder with his baton. "Eyes front," the MP ordered. "You didn't cover your eyes when they were taken away. You won't cover them now." He stood there until the woman slowly, shakingly lowered her hands. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Open them," the guard commanded, his voice cold as steel. "Look at what was done in your name." Forced compliance turned the theater into a pressure cooker. Sobs replaced the whispers. The sound of retching came from the back rows. Elsa felt bile rise in her throat. The film showed the camp guards, not monsters with horns, but women. Women in uniforms just like the auxiliary corps. Elsa had wanted to join. They were smiling. They were standing next to piles of bone and skin. Elsa recognized the uniform. She recognized the insignia. She recognized the hairstyle. These were her peers, her neighbors. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The monster wasn't a foreigner. The monster spoke German. "It can't be," she whispered. But the narrator's voice droned on, listing the camps: Dachau, Belsen, Auschwitz. Names she had heard mentioned only in hushed tones, now screamed their reality in black and white. The screen showed a local German mayor and his wife being forced to tour the camp. They were dressed in fine clothes, holding handkerchiefs to their noses to block the smell of death. Elsa looked at her own hands. Were they clean, or had her silence been a form of collaboration? The locked doors weren't keeping her in. They were forcing her to look inside herself. Then, a scream pierced the darkness. It wasn't a scream of general horror. It was a specific, shattering cry of recognition. A woman in the middle row stood up, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. The footage showed a group of female SS guards being arrested at Belsen. "That is Lisa," the woman shrieked. "That is the baker's daughter, Lisa." She turned to the women around her, eyes wild. "We had coffee with her mother. She said she was working in a factory." The realization spread like a virus. The monster on the screen wasn't a stranger. It was the girl next door. The woman who had screamed collapsed into her seat, hyperventilating, clutching her chest. Another woman, seeing the piles of bodies being bulldozed, simply fainted, sliding silently to the floor between the rows. The theater erupted into chaos. Some were sobbing, some were vomiting, and others were banging on the locked doors, begging to be let out. "Lights!" Lieutenant Vance shouted. The projector was cut. The film reel spun to a halt. The harsh house lights flickered on, blinding the women after the darkness. The sudden silence was almost louder than the screams. Vance stood on the stage, looking down at them. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sickened. He waited for the sobbing to subside, for them to look at him. He held up a single piece of paper, a map. "You recognize the baker's daughter," Vance said quietly. "But you claim you didn't recognize the smell." He unfolded the map. "This camp," he pointed to a red circle, "is 5 miles from your town. 5 miles. When the wind blew east, you smelled burning flesh. You told yourselves it was the glue factory. You told yourselves it was burning trash." He lowered the map. "You knew. You all knew. You just chose not to see." Elsa stared at the floor, tears dripping onto her uniform. Vance's words cut deeper than the film. She remembered the ash that sometimes fell on her family's garden in the summer of '44. Her father had brushed it off the table, saying it was from the coal plant. She remembered the trains that passed at night, filled with people, returning empty. She remembered the silence. The locked doors of the theater were nothing compared to the locked doors of her own conscience. "The film is not over," Vance announced. "Sit down, watch the rest, or we will bring the victims here to tell you themselves." The threat hung in the air. The women who had stood up slowly sank back into their chairs. The fainting woman was helped up by a nurse. There was no escape. Vance signaled the booth. Click. The lights died again. Whir. The projector started. The nightmare resumed, but this time they had no excuse to hide behind. When the doors finally unlocked, no one moved. The film had ended 10 minutes ago. Lieutenant Vance had left the stage, but the women sat frozen, staring at the blank white screen as if the images were burned into their retinas. Slowly, like sleepwalkers, they began to stand up. They walked out of the theater, into the bright July afternoon sun. The sunlight felt offensive. It felt wrong that the birds were singing, and the sky was blue after what they had just witnessed. The march to the mess hall was silent. Usually this was the time for chatter, for trading gossip. Today there was only the sound of hundreds of boots shuffling in the dust. Elsa walked with her head down. She felt dirty. She felt that everyone looking at her, the American guards, the local civilians passing by the fence, could see the ash on her skin. The denial was gone, replaced by a suffocating cloak of shame. Dinner was vegetable soup and dark bread. Elsa sat at the long wooden table, staring at her metal bowl. The soup was grayish, with chunks of potato floating in it. An hour ago, she would have devoured it. Now, looking at the gray liquid, her stomach turned violently. It reminded her of the muddy pits in the film. It reminded her of the starvation she had just seen on screen. She pushed the bowl away. Around her, hundreds of women did the same. "Eat," a guard shouted. "You complained about being hungry yesterday. Eat." But the command had no power. It wasn't rebellion. It was physical incapacity. The guilt had lodged itself in their throats like a stone. Elsa looked at the bread in her hand. She remembered the baker's daughter on the screen. Liesel, the SS guard. Had Liesel eaten bread like this after her shift at the camp? Had she wiped the ash off her uniform and sat down to dinner? The bread fell from Elsa's hand. Night fell over Barrack 9. The lights were out, but sleep was impossible. The sounds of the night were different. Usually, there was snoring, whispering. Tonight, there was weeping. Quiet, muffled sobbing from beneath the scratchy wool blankets. Elsa lay on her back, staring at the bunk above her. Every time she closed her eyes, the projector beam flickered in her mind. She saw the eyes of the victims staring directly at her, asking, "Why didn't you ask where the trains were going?" "I didn't know," she whispered into the dark. She tried to say the words to test if they still held any weight. "I didn't know." But in the silence of the barracks, the lie sounded hollow. It crumbled into dust. She knew the smell, the trains, the disappearances. She had known enough to look away, and looking away was the crime. She rolled over and buried her face in her pillow, wishing she could scream, but knowing she had lost the right to make a sound. The next morning, the exhaustion was palpable. Elsa and a small detail were marched to a nearby field hospital to scrub floors. This wasn't a military hospital. It was a displaced persons center, housing those who had nowhere to go. Elsa knelt on the cold tiles, dipping her brush into soapy water. Her movements were slow. The images from the film played on a loop in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the piles. Now she kept her eyes on the suds, afraid to look up. A pair of worn shoes stopped near her hand. They were old leather shoes, too large for the feet inside them. Elsa stopped scrubbing. She held her breath. Slowly, her gaze traveled up the thin ankles, the rough trousers, to a hand resting on a cane. The hand was skeletal, the skin translucent like parchment, and there, on the inside of the forearm, was a jagged line of blue ink, a hera, 7439, a tattoo, the mark of the camps. Elsa froze. This wasn't a movie screen. This was a living, breathing human being standing inches from her. She slowly raised her head. The man was elderly, though starvation made it hard to tell his age. He had deep, sunken eyes that seemed to hold an infinite weariness. He wasn't looking at her with hatred. He was looking at her German uniform with a quiet, devastating recognition. He didn't move away. He just stood there, existing, a living proof of her nation's crime. The shame was physically painful. Elsa wanted to vanish into the floor. She remembered the "I didn't know" she had whispered last night. Looking at this man's arm, the lie burned her tongue. Her trembling lips parted. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. "Es tut mir leid," she choked out, barely a whisper. "I am sorry." The words hung in the antiseptic air, small and pathetic against the magnitude of the number on his arm. The man looked at her for a long moment. He didn't scream. He didn't spit. He simply adjusted his grip on the cane and nodded slowly, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement that she had finally seen him. "Sorry does not bring them back," he said in flawless, accented German. Then he turned and walked slowly down the hallway, the tap-tap of his cane echoing like a clock, counting down the years of lost lives. Elsa remained kneeling on the wet tiles. The water in her bucket was gray and dirty. She looked at her reflection in it. She realized that the movie hadn't ended when the lights came up. The movie was her life now. She picked up the brush. She scrubbed harder than before, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just cleaning a floor anymore. She was trying to scrub away a stain that was tattooed not on her arm, but on her soul. Elsa was released in the winter of 1946. She walked out of the camp gates carrying a cardboard suitcase and a heavy heart. Germany was a landscape of ruins. In every town, people were busy rebuilding, eager to bury the past along with the rubble. "We didn't know," they said to each other. "We were victims too," they whispered. But Elsa couldn't join the chorus. The images from the locked theater were burned onto her retinas. The number A7439 was etched into her memory. Silence was no longer an option. She became a history teacher. It was not an easy path. Parents complained. They wanted their children to learn about German heroes, not German crimes. But Elsa stood at the front of the classroom, chalk in hand, unyielding. She didn't show them the gruesome films, they were too young, but she drew the maps. She showed them the train lines. She taught them that evil doesn't always wear a monster's mask. Sometimes it wears the uniform of a neighbor who chooses to look away. Years turned into decades. The ruins were cleared, replaced by glass skyscrapers. The camps became museums. One rainy afternoon, an elderly Elsa visited the memorial site of the camp she had been forced to watch on screen. It was quiet now, just grass and stone markers. She walked to the wall where the names of the victims were engraved. She ran her wrinkled fingers over the cold stone, searching. She didn't find the baker's daughter, but she found thousands of others. A group of students was touring the site. They were laughing, checking their phones, disconnected from the horror under their feet. Elsa watched them, feeling a flash of the old anger. But then, a young girl stopped. She looked at a display of old shoes. The same pile Elsa had seen on the screen 50 years ago. The girl stopped laughing. She went silent. Tears filled her eyes. Elsa walked over and gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Do not look away," Elsa whispered. It was the same command Lieutenant Vance had given her. But now it was spoken with love, not force. "It hurts to look. But if we close our eyes, the trains will come back." The girl looked at the old woman, seeing the pain etched in her face. She nodded slowly. The cycle of silence was broken. The lesson had been passed on. History is not just what is written in books. It is what we choose to remember when we want to forget. Elsa learned that the locked door wasn't the punishment. It was the cure for blindness. If you believe in the power of truth, hit that subscribe button. Share this video to ensure that we never look away again. Thank you for watching.